The contents of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events and figures discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of the events portrayed. This episode contains discussions of death, body violation, racial exploitation, and systematic violence. Listener discretion is advised. I want you to imagine something for me. You go to the doctor. You get a diagnosis, and it's something serious, something that actually requires surgery. And the surgeon who operates on you knows exactly what they're doing. They know exactly where to cut, and they know exactly what they find when they get inside. They know how the human body is actually constructed, not just in theory, and not just from diagrams copied from animal dissections, but from direct, hands-on, repeated experience with actual living anatomy. And that knowledge, the knowledge that makes modern surgery possible, the knowledge that has saved hundreds of millions of lives, that is the same knowledge that sits at the foundation of every medical school on earth. That knowledge, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from bodies. Specifically, it came from a period of about 150 years, during which the demand for human cadavers vastly outstripped the legal supply. And the gap was filled by one of the most morally complicated, legally ambiguous, and occasionally murderous black markets in history. It came from men with shovels and lanterns, working in the dark, digging up the newly dead. It came from the bodies of the poor, the imprisoned, the enslaved, and the executed, the people whose bodies in life had been considered expendable. And they shortly discovered in death that the expendability had followed them into the grave. It came in at least 16 documented cases in Edinburgh in the 1820s from murder. Welcome to the Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and today we're going to be talking about the body trade, the literal market for human corpses that kept anatomy schools running for over a century. We're going to talk about the men who built careers supplying it and the communities who fought back against it. And the question that runs underneath all of it like a current that you can't quite see. And that question is, whose bodies have always been considered valuable and whose bodies haven't? That question, I promise you, did not stay safely in the past. So let's go. But to understand the body trade, you have to understand the state of medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries. And specifically, you have to understand how utterly, catastrophically wrong most of it actually was. For roughly 1,300 years, from the 2nd century AD until the mid-16th century, the foundational text of Western medical knowledge was the work of a Greek physician named Galen. Galen was brilliant. Galen was influential. Galen was the type of figure whose authority becomes so entrenched that challenging it starts to feel not just professionally risky, but almost sacrilegious. Galen was also, in some significant ways, very, very wrong. And the reason he was wrong is both very simple and both very telling. Galen never dissected a human body. Roman law actually prohibited it. So Galen dissected animals, pigs, dogs, Barbary monkeys, and he extrapolated from there. He made the leap to human anatomy. But we're talking about animals. Anyway, we'll get to that. Don't worry. So, for 13 centuries, the standard medical education in Europe was built on the anatomy of pigs and dogs. Wow. The implications of this were not abstract. They were carved into people's bodies by surgeons who believed they understood human anatomy and very much didn't. They were wrong about the liver, and they were wrong about the heart. They were also wrong about the reproductive system. And they were operating on patients based on a physiological map drawn from an entirely different species. The man who finally definitively broke with Galen was a Flemish physician named Andreas Vesalius, who published his landmark work on the fabric of the human body in 1543. It is one of the most important books in the history of medicine. It is, if you read between the lines of the historical records, the work of a man who got very, very good at sourcing cadavers through, we'll call it, extra-legal means. The Flemish physician was a student in Paris and then Padua, at a time when the legal supply of cadavers for medical education was essentially non-existent. In most of Europe, the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals. And not all criminals. There was only a specific subset that was designated for that purpose. And in those quantities translated to roughly 2 or 3 bodies a year for an entire medical school. 2 to 3 a year for all of those students. So this Flemish physician did what ambitious medical students across Europe would do for the next 3 centuries. He found other means. He haunted execution grounds. He claimed bodies before they could be buried. He crept through cemeteries at night. And he once, by his own account, stole a body from a gibbet. That's the iron cage in which executed criminals were sometimes displayed as a warning. And he stole that body while the gibbet was still hanging. He understood human anatomy because he refused to accept the legal constraints on how the knowledge could be contained. And his refusal, it produced a revolution in medicine that every one of us benefits from, even today. And I'm not telling you this to make him sound heroic. Well, not exactly anyway. But I'm telling you this because his solution to the anatomy crisis became, over the next 3 centuries, an entire industry. And that industry was very clear about whose bodies went into the market and whose bodies didn't. So let's talk about the law, because the law is where the body trade actually begins. Not in those cemeteries, not with the cadavers, but in Parliament. In England, the legal framework governing the supply of bodies to anatomy schools was established by Henry VIII in 1540, when he granted the Company of Barber Surgeons the right to claim 4 bodies per year from the gallows. 4 bodies per year for all of London. And that number remained essentially unchanged for about 200 years. In 1752, the Murder Act did expand it slightly. Judges could now sentence murderers to dissection as an additional punishment, a deliberate choice designated to make the sentence more terrifying, since the destruction of the body was understood to have implications for resurrection. The soul needed a body to rise on Judgment Day, and dissecting a murderer wasn't just a punishment. It was, in the theological framework of that time, a way of damning them to hell forever. And that's worth sitting with for a minute. The law understood that anatomical dissection was a horror, and it used it explicitly as a deterrent, as an additional cruelty that was added to someone's execution. And then they wondered why the families of the non-criminally dead were so resistant to having their loved ones up on the dissection table. By the early 19th century, London had somewhere between 12 and 20 anatomy schools operating simultaneously with hundreds of students each, and they all needed to practice on cadavers regularly. The legal supply was, by very conservative estimates, meeting somewhere between 3 and 10% of the demand. 3 to 10%. The rest had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the graveyard. They called themselves resurrection men. The public called them body snatchers, grave robbers, and sack-em-up men. Whatever you wanted to call them, they were, by early 19th century standards at least, a professional class. They were organized, skilled, and occasionally unionized in their own informal way. And they operated in a legal gray area that was genuinely strange. Because here is the legal technicality that made the body trade possible in the first place. And it's also the legal technicality that Parliament refused to close for many decades. A corpse is not property. Yeah, so under English common law, you could not own a dead body, which means that stealing a dead body was not theft. It was not a felony. It was not a capital offense at all. It was, at worst, a misdemeanor, a fine, maybe a few months in jail, if you were even caught. What was theft was the shroud, the coffin, and the jewelry buried with the body. So the resurrection men learned very quickly: strip the body, leave the grave goods, take nothing but the corpse itself. The body they could sell for 10 to 14 guineas. The shroud, on the other hand, would have definitely gotten them hanged. The technique the resurrection men used was actually very efficient. A team of 2 or 3 men would work a fresh grave. A burial more than a week old was considered to be stale and nearly worthless to the anatomy schools. The anatomy schools needed fresh specimens. So, the resurrection men would excavate the head of the coffin only. They would break through the wood, loop a rope through and around the corpse, and haul it out without disturbing the rest of the grave. This whole operation, if practiced, could take under an hour. And then, once they were done, the soil was stamped back in place, and by morning, the grave looked undisturbed. The anatomy schools paid well, and they asked absolutely no questions. The going rate for an adult body in London in the 1820s was 8 to 10 guineas. That's roughly the equivalent of several weeks' work for anyone that was in the working class and was a laborer. Unusual specimens commanded premiums. Very tall individuals or very obese individuals, even people with particular deformities or medical conditions, that made them more scientifically interesting. And children, well, they were priced by the inch. And I want to pause on that last detail for just a minute. Children were priced by the inch. There was a market with pricing structures specifically designed for the bodies of children, and anatomy schools participated in that market. That is not a rumor. That is actually in the documented court records. And the body trade, it was national. Resurrection men in London developed relationships with their counterparts in Edinburgh, and in Dublin, and in Bristol. Bodies were shipped in barrels, and they were labeled as preservatives or salted fish. There was a network, albeit it was very informal, and it was adaptive, and it was driven entirely by the market demand. But that market spanned the entire country. And the demand, oh, that was insatiable. Because medicine, at that time in history, was growing by leaps and bounds. And because anatomy schools were multiplying. And because the number of students who needed to learn on cadavers was increasing each year. And that legal supply, well, it stayed flat. They needed the resurrection men. Let's be real. We needed the resurrection men. Because the things that they did in the dark turned into modern medicine. Now, I'm not saying it's right, but we're going to push on. But here's something about the body trade that the history books tend to gloss over, or they only mention briefly before moving on to the more dramatically satisfying story of Burke and Hare. Don't worry, we'll get there. The resurrection men, they didn't dig up graves randomly. They were considered professionals. They went where the digging was going to be the easiest. They went where the community defenses were the weakest, and where the risk of being caught was the lowest. So where did they go? They went to poor neighborhoods. Because wealthy families could afford to protect their dead, they could pay for watchers. Watchers were men who were hired to guard a fresh grave through the night until the body was no longer fresh enough to be considered marketable. They would purchase iron mort safes, which were essentially cages that bolted over the grave. Or they could purchase mort stones, which were massive slabs of rock that were way too heavy to move without equipment. Wealthy families could also afford private mausoleums with locked doors, and they could afford burial in church crypts rather than just the churchyard soil. Poor families, they couldn't afford any of that. Their dead went into the common ground, in shallow graves, and with no protection and no watchers. Their dead were the ones who ended up in the dissecting rooms. In Scotland, the pattern was even more stark. The anatomy schools of Edinburgh, which was the most prestigious in the world in the early 19th century, those anatomy schools had particular relationships with the poorhouses and the workhouses. Any inmates who died in those institutions were sometimes provided directly to those anatomy schools. And the bodies of those people, they had no families. They had no family to claim them, no community to defend their grave, and they had no money to purchase any form of protection. These people, these were the bodies that built the medical knowledge of the 19th century. And in America, the pattern had a specific and devastating racial dimension to it. In the antebellum South, the bodies of enslaved people were legally property. They could be sold, rented, or donated to medical schools by the people who had enslaved them. There was no consent required, and there were no legal protections at that time. Southern medical schools were, in many cases, better supplied than the northern ones precisely because of this fact. Because the bodies of enslaved people were simply available in a way that the bodies of the non-enslaved people of the North were not. After emancipation, the legal framework changed, but the practical vulnerability did not. Cemeteries containing enslaved people in the South were targeted by body snatchers at a rate that is appalling even by today's contemporary observers. The graves were shallower, the communities poorer, the authorities less responsive to complaints. And the bodies of those Southern enslaved people continued to fill anatomy school dissecting tables long after the formal end of slavery. Medical historian Harriet Washington, in her essential medical book, The Medical Apartheid, she documents this pattern in exhaustive, devastating detail. The body trade did not operate on a principle of equal opportunity. It operated on a principle of least resistance. And least resistance followed the grooves of existing oppression with perfect fidelity. The poor fed medicine's hunger for the dead. The enslaved poor fed it most of all. Now, I want to take a few minutes here to talk about resistance, because the popular narrative of the body trade tends to focus on the supplies in the schools, and it treats the communities being robbed as passive victims. They were not passive. They fought back, and their resistance, while ultimately unsuccessful in the short term, is one of the most important parts of this story. Let's talk about the anatomy riots. There were dozens of these riots across Britain and America throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and they follow a remarkably consistent pattern. A community discovers or suspects that bodies are being taken from their graveyard, or that a local anatomy school is receiving stolen remains. The community mobilizes, and violence follows. The most significant American example is the New York Doctors' Riot of 1788. The immediate trigger was the moment of almost unbelievable provocation. A medical student at New York Hospital reportedly dangled a dissected arm out of a window at a child who was looking in, and reportedly shouted that it was the arm of the child's mother. Now, this may or may not be exactly what happened. What is documented is that the child's father went to the cemetery and checked his wife's grave. Guess what happened? He found it empty, and he returned to his neighborhood to tell the people what he had found. Within hours, a mob of thousands had descended on the hospital. They found dissected bodies inside, and they destroyed the facility. There was a militia called, and by the time it was over, somewhere between 3 and 20 people were dead. That exact number is disputed, and the medical establishment of New York was thoroughly under siege from then forward. The state legislature passed a new law within a year, but it didn't solve the problem. It never solved the problem, because the law kept trying to address the symptom, which was the theft. And the law didn't address the cause, which was the catastrophic mismatch between the legal supply of bodies and the medical need for them. In Edinburgh, the rights took a slightly different form: targeted attacks on individual resurrection men when they were caught, and justice delivered right there in the street. There is a documented case of a resurrection man being chased into the Firth of Forth and drowning. There are documented cases of men being beaten within an inch of their lives for being discovered that they were resurrection men. And there were more quiet forms of resistance. There were watch committees, and they were organized by working class communities who couldn't afford the commercial grave watching services. And those people were taking turns sitting with the newly dead through the night. There were communal mortstone funds where neighbors would pool their money together to purchase protective stones for their graves. There was also the careful attention to which nights the body snatchers preferred to work, and the adjustment of burial timings accordingly. These communities understood what was happening. They understood the anatomy schools were consuming their dead, and they understood that wealth protected them and poverty did not. And what they did with what little resources they had was everything that they could to possibly protect themselves both here and in the next life. And they were not passive. They were just outgunned. And now we come to the part that everybody knows, or thinks that they know. Burke and Hare. Edinburgh, 1827. The most prestigious center of medical education in the entire world. An anatomy school run by Dr. Robert Knox, who was one of the most celebrated lecturers of the era, and was a man who drew students from across Europe and America. And this was a school that needed bodies, that always needed bodies. And they paid well for those bodies, and they asked absolutely no questions. William Hare was an Irish laborer who ran a lodging house in the West Point district of Edinburgh, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in the city, by the way. And William Burke was an Irish cobbler who had come to Scotland looking for work and ended up as a lodger in Hare's establishment. The partnership began with an accident, and that accident was, in its own bleak way, entirely logical. In November of 1827, an elderly lodger named Donald died at Hare's establishment, owing back rent. Hare and Burke faced a choice: absorb the loss or find a way to recoup it. A local carter mentioned in passing that the anatomy schools paid well for fresh bodies. Hare and Burke delivered Donald's corpse to Dr. Knox's school on Surgeon Square. They collected £7 and 10 shillings and went home. They had solved their problem. Then they thought about solving it again. The leap from selling a body that was already dead to creating a body for the purpose of selling it is, I think, psychologically one of the most important transitions in this entire story. And the historical record actually suggests that it happened gradually, incrementally, and almost accidentally at first. A sick lodger here, a vulnerable visitor there, and a decision made in the moment that didn't feel quite like a decision at all. The method they delivered was efficient and left no marks. One man would restrain the victim, and the other would cover their mouth and nose while pressing down on their chest, preventing them from breathing. And it would also prevent the type of struggle that would leave bruising and any evidence of violence. There were deaths by asphyxiation, and they positioned the bodies to look like a natural death from someone who had just been drinking. The technique became known after the trial as burking. It entered the language as a verb. To burk someone means to suppress or to silence them. The etymology is a murder method. So between 1827 and October of 1828, Burke and Hare murdered 16 people. And those 16 people, I want to say their names, because this is the part of the story that gets the least attention. Not the mechanics of the murder, not the trial, not the sensational details, but the people who were actually killed, the people who were turned into commodities. Abigail Simpson, who was a pensioner from Gilmerton. She sold salt and camstone door to door. She came to Edinburgh for a market day, and she made the mistake of accepting an invitation for a drink from people she didn't know well enough to distrust. She was killed the following morning. Mary Haldane, a woman in her 60s. She was a habitual drinker, and she was known in the Westport. Her daughter Peggy came looking for her and was killed in the same week. An elderly woman known only as the Cinder Woman. Her name was never recorded, and her identity was never established. She collected cinders from ash pits for resale, and she died in the lodging house, and no one reported her missing because no one knew her enough to miss her. Joseph. He was a young boy, and he was the son of a woman who had already been killed. He was described in testimony as being daft or touched, what we might now call having an intellectual disability. He just came looking for his mother, and he was killed and delivered to Knox's school. Anne McDougall, who was a cousin of Burke's common-law wife. She visited from Falkirk and did not return home. Then there was James Wilson, who was known in the neighborhood as Daft Jamie. He was only 18 years old, and he was described as having an intellectual disability, and it was well known in the streets of Edinburgh. But he was a familiar and genuinely beloved figure. His murder caused particular horror when it became known, because the students at Knox's school recognized him on the dissecting table, and Knox reportedly began the dissection with the face, so he could possibly destroy the identification. Then that brings us to Mary Patterson. She was 19 years old, and she was a sex worker. She was lured to the lodging house in the morning and killed before noon. Knox kept her body in whiskey for 3 months. Her youth and her beauty made her a very prized anatomical specimen, and he even had her portrait drawn before the dissection. Several of his students actually knew her personally, and he started her dissection with the face as well. And I want to stay here for a moment with Mary Patterson, because her story crystallizes something about this entire history that I think is very essential to understand. Mary Patterson was 19 years old. She was known personally to several of the men who actually studied her dissected body. Knox knew his students would recognize her, and he kept her anyway. And when they dissected her, like I said, he began with her face. And Knox, he was never charged with anything. Not then, and not ever. Mary Patterson existed in the logic of the medical establishment as simply a resource. Not as a person, but as a resource. And the system that produced that logic, the body market, the anatomy schools, and the refusal of Parliament to address the legal supply, well, that made that not just possible, but routine. The partnership of Burke and Hare ended on Halloween night in 1828, when a couple who rented a room in Hare's establishment, James and Anne Gray, they noticed suspicious behavior, and they discovered the body of a woman named Marjorie Docherty hidden under the straw in the lodging house. So they went to the police. Hare and his wife were arrested the same night. Burke and his other partners were arrested shortly after. The evidence against all four was circumstantial and very complicated. And to ensure a conviction, the prosecutor made a deal. Hare would turn King's evidence and testify against Burke, and in exchange, Hare would walk away free. And he did. William Burke was convicted of murder and hanged on January the 28th, 1829, in front of a crowd estimated at 25,000 people. And in a stroke of almost perfect irony, his body was publicly dissected the following day at the Edinburgh Medical School, the same institution that created the conditions up for his crimes. His skeleton remains to this day on display at the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum. A wallet made from his skin is also held at Surgeons Hall Museum. Robert Knox, who purchased at least 12 of Burke and Hare's 16 victims, was found incautious by an inquiry committee and he did suffer significant damage to his professional reputation. But he was never charged, and he never went to prison. And the weird fact is that he continued to practice medicine until the end of his life. The man who bought the bodies was never held accountable for where they came from. The Burke and Hare case created a political crisis that Parliament could no longer ignore. The public horror was total. The question of where anatomy schools got their bodies had become suddenly impossible to avoid. The result of the Anatomy Act of 1832, and I want to spend some time on this because the Anatomy Act is often discussed as the solution. The reform that cleared up the body trade, the reform that regularized the supply of cadavers, and the act that ended all of the resurrection men. It did do some of that, but what it actually did and who it did it to is considerably more complicated. The act actually created a system for voluntary donation. It allowed people to donate their bodies to medical science. This was, in practice, a very reasonable approach. In practice, though, voluntary donation was very rare. And the theological anxieties about body resurrection were real and they were very wildly held. And the social stigma attached to dissection, which had once been a punishment for murders, that did not vanish because Parliament passed a law. So the act, in essence, did something else. It made the unclaimed bodies of people who died in workhouses available by default for anatomical dissection. And if you died in a workhouse and had no family member to claim your body within 48 hours, you went to an anatomy school. So let me translate that to you in concrete terms. The people dying in workhouses in 1832 England were the poorest people in the country. Many of them had been separated from their families by the very circumstances of poverty. They had moved looking for work, they had lost contacts with their relatives, their families themselves were in workhouses in different districts. That 48-hour window was for many families simply impossible to meet. The Anatomy Act did not solve the body trade. It legislated it. It took the existing practice, which was that the poor were feeding medicine's appetite for the dead, and it gave it legal sanction. The working class opposition to the act was immediate, loud, and completely reasonable. They understood exactly what was being done to them. Commentators at the time, including some within Parliament, made the point explicitly that the act punished poverty with dissection, and it passed anyway. And in America, the equivalent legislation, which was passed state by state through the mid to late 19th century. Well, that legislation followed the same pattern with an added layer of racial targeting. Unclaimed bodies in many southern and border states meant in practice enslaved people's bodies or formerly enslaved people's bodies. And the legal framework of the Anatomy Acts, they formalized what the resurrection men had been doing informally, that the bodies of the marginalized went into the medical machinery of the privileged. The body trade simply changed its legal status. It didn't change its logic. I want to take a moment here that might feel a little counterintuitive, because I think it's important to be honest about what the body trade actually produced, and not to justify it and not to perform the "but look how far we've come" gesture that will let us off of the hook. Because the truth is way more complicated than bad things happened and now we're moving on. The anatomy crisis and the desperate measures taken to resolve it produced real medicine. Not metaphorical medicine, not abstract scientific process, actual, specific, life-saving medical knowledge. William Henry's discovery of blood circulation in 1628 required cadavers. The development techniques developed by Joseph Lister in the 1860s required a very detailed understanding of human anatomy that could have only come from dissection. And the training of surgeons who could perform procedures that have become routine in the 21st century as we know it today, things like appendectomies, cesarean sections, and the repair of traumatic injury, all of those required hands-on practice with human bodies. I am by no means saying that the ends justify the means, not by a long shot. But what I am saying is the means and the end are entangled in a way that demands that we hold both truths simultaneously. The knowledge that saved lives came from those people who were not treated worth saving. The surgery that heals was built on the violation of the dead. And that is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but I think we need to sit with it just the same. The body trade as a literal market for corpses ended in the most egregious forms by the late 19th century. The combination of legal reform, increased voluntary donations over time, and the development of other teaching methods gradually reduced the demand for specifically stolen dead. But the pattern, the specific logic that made certain bodies valuable and others not, that pattern, it did not end. It changed its form, the way that pressure always does. It changed his lab coat, as I will get into in the postscript episode. But let me plant a few seeds here first. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which we will cover in a full episode later this season, ran from 1932 to 1972. For 40 years, the United States Public Health Service watched 399 African American men in Alabama go untreated for syphilis. They purposely withheld treatment even after syphilis became the standard cure. And they did that in order to study the natural progression of the disease. The men were not told they were in a study. They were told that they were receiving treatment for bad blood. The logic of the Tuskegee study, that African American bodies were available for medical research in ways that Caucasian bodies were not, is the direct descendant of that logic that ended African American cemeteries in the 19th century. J. Marion Sims, who is credited with developing the surgical repair for vesiciovaginal fissures and is sometimes called the father of gynecology, developed his technique by operating repeatedly without anesthesia on enslaved African American women. He operated on one woman 30 times, and he justified that absence of anesthesia, which was readily available at the time, by invoking the belief, which was widespread in the 19th century, that African American people experienced pain differently and less acutely than Caucasian people. Of course, this belief was false. The studies that supposedly supported it were not studies at all. They were simply rationalizations, and they did not die with the 19th century, I'm sad to say. Research published in 2016 found that a significant percentage of medical students and residents still endorse those false beliefs about biological differences in pain tolerance between African American and Caucasian patients. Those beliefs directly affect the pain management that they provide. The body trade's deepest legacy is not the physical one. It is the intellectual one, the accumulated set of assumptions about whose bodies exist for what purposes, and about whose pain registers as real pain, and about whose life is actually a life. That legacy is still treating patients to this day. At the beginning of this episode, I asked you to imagine going to the doctor, to trust the knowledge in the room with you. And I want you to hold that image now with everything else that you've heard alongside it. Because the knowledge in that room was built on the bodies of the people who were never asked, who were dug up in the night. Those people were murdered in lodging houses, or they were taken from a workhouse before their family could be notified, or they were operated on repeatedly without consent because they were property and their pain didn't really count. The knowledge was real, but that violation is also real. And both things are true, and they do not cancel each other out. If you've listened to some of my other episodes, you know that Frau Trophia danced in the streets of Strasbourg until someone paid attention to the wrong thing about her. The unnamed woman in Edinburgh's dissecting rooms were reduced to specimens with price tags. The pattern is so consistent across so many centuries and so many contexts that it stops feeling like coincidence and it starts feeling like this was orchestrated, or that there's architecture somewhere that we just don't have access to. So whose bodies historically have been considered the most available? Well, that's the bodies of the poor, the bodies of the imprisoned, the bodies of the enslaved, and the bodies of people who in life could not protect themselves from the systems that used them, and in death could not protect themselves from the systems that still used them. This is not a story about individual monsters. Robert Knox was not uniquely evil. Burke and Hare were not aberrations. They were participants. Participants in a system that made their behavior logical, profitable, and for the people at the top of the supply chain, entirely defensible. The monster, as always, was the system. And the system, as always, took very good care of itself. This has been The Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and if this episode disturbed you, well then good. If you want to go deeper, I recommend Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, which is the most rigorous and necessary treatment of the American dimension of this story that I have ever encountered. Ruth Richardson's Death, Dissection, and the Destitute covers the British side with comparable depth and moral seriousness. The people who built modern medicine with their bodies deserve to be remembered as people, not as specimens. So until next time, stay dark.